Pan's Labyrinth movie review. So this is a movie that I had been interested in seeing for quite some time. It had gotten a lot of praise, both by professional critics and by friends of mine, people I knew who saw it and were very strongly recommending it to me. Initially, I was unable to see it because I was living in Japan. It was actually in the Japanese video rental stores, DVD rental stores, but they didn't have English subtitles on it because it's a Spanish language movie. So if I got it home, I could either watch it in Spanish or I could watch it in Spanish with Japanese subtitles on it, which I could maybe have understood some of, but you know, it wouldn't have been the same. So I delayed watching it until I got back to the US, even though this movie just kept getting more and more praise, and by the time I finally got around to seeing it, my expectations were quite high. That, and in the intervening time, I'd also seen Hellboy and Hellboy 2 by the same director. Whose name is, what was his name again? Guillermo del Toro is how you pronounce it. Sorry, I should have written that down before I started filming, huh? But anyways, the director of Hellboy and Hellboy 2, and have been very impressed by those movies. So I was looking forward to Pan's Labyrinth. And what can I say? It is a wonderful movie. All the praise that you've heard about this movie is correct. The fantasy parts of it are beautifully done, and they completely draw you into this fairy tale-esque world. The historical parts of it are also very well done. Now, one of the reasons I'd been curious to see this movie is because I heard it was about the Spanish Civil War. And the Spanish Civil War is one of my historical interests. Not something I know a ton about per se, but something I've always been vaguely interested in. Turns out, I had no idea prior to watching this, it turns out that this film takes place in 1944, so after the Spanish War was over, but there was a Maquis force that was still fighting against the fascist forces in the mountains, which I knew nothing about. In fact, prior to seeing this movie, I didn't even realize that the Maquis, the word Maquis, comes from these type of forces. I believe, according to Wikipedia, it was first used for the French resistance force, but was also used for the Spanish resistance force. I think I had been familiar with the word Maquis because I had been a Star Trek fan. So, you know, in Star Trek Deep Space Nine, I think there's it talks about the Bajoran Maquis force, and I just thought, I don't know what I thought. I thought it was a made-up word or something like that. So this was the first time I actually realized that this word was a word of a historical group. Now, you don't really learn a lot about the history of the Maquis, the Spanish Maquis, by watching this movie. But then you're not meant to. This movie is just to get your interest up, to let you know that they exist. They can't really teach you a lot in 2 hours, and then you go to Wikipedia or whatever to do the rest of the research on your own. And there's an interesting Wikipedia article on the Spanish Maquis. I think if you put in the word Maquis, which is M-A-Q-U-I-S, the first one that pops up will be the French Maquis, but then if you go to disambugantation, other uses, then the Spanish Maquis will be one of the ones you can choose from that. Finally, this film is quite powerful emotionally without ever resorting to sappiness. Now, a common complaint I have against a lot of Hollywood movies is they work way too hard to try to manipulate my emotions. But in this case, in this movie, everything comes naturally from the story. So there's no unearned emotion. So yeah, it's a great film, just like everybody told me it would be. Not a lot to add here. Well, alright, if I was going to be greedy, I guess you could lament that the story doesn't do more. The idea of mixing in fantasy elements into a historical narrative is genius. And I know it's been done before. I'm not sure if there's a word for this particular type of genre, but it works. It's interesting both because of the historical element and because of the fantasy element. But both stories in and of themselves, so you have the fantasy story going on and you have the historical story going on, both stories in and of themselves are pretty thin. I'm not quite sure if the fantasy part is meant as padding for the historical section, or if the historical section was meant to be padding out the fantasy parts. But at times, I wished that either story had more meat to it. The visual elements were great. The fantasy part had a lot of great visuals, but the actual story was lacking. I know it's easy to criticize, and when you're juggling two different genres like this, it's difficult to strike the right balance. But all I'm saying, if I was going to be greedy and to ask for more, this is what I would have asked for. A more immersive story.